Everyone's been asking whether Rick Grimes went too far, whether he became a villain, whether the man who bit out Joe's throat in the dark or executed unarmed men in a church was still, in any meaningful sense, the sheriff from King County who believed in due process and protecting even the guilty from mob justice. But I think we've been looking in the wrong direction entirely. The more I sat with that question, the more I pulled at the thread, the harder it became to ignore what was underneath it. Because the real question isn't whether Rick went too far. It's whether the show ever intended to let him stay the same. Whether the arc we watched across 9 seasons was a character responding to his circumstances, or a story fulfilling a design that was always there, underneath everything, waiting to be completed. He wore a watch throughout all of it. Old, worn, a thing from before. What if Rick didn't change because he wanted to, but because the story was never going to let him stay the same? I didn't want to believe there was a blueprint for this. I genuinely didn't. When I first watched the season 5 finale, when Rick stands in front of the Alexandria town meeting, unwashed and unshaven and vibrating with something the community can't quite name as threat, I read it as character development. A man shaped by impossible circumstances into something harder, understandable, even in context, admirable. It took rewatching the whole arc from the beginning, with the ending already in mind, to see it differently. We are the ones who live. That's what Rick says in that finale. After Pete's death, after the confrontation with Deanna, and the community, and the formal, terrifying spectacle of a man making his case to people who don't yet understand what they are looking at. The line lands as triumph in the moment. The music says triumph. The editing says triumph. Rick Grimes, who has survived everything the show put him through, standing and declaring that his people live, that they are defined by their survival, that this is the thing that sets them apart from everyone they've lost and everything they've been through, and the watches on his wrist throughout the speech. I keep coming back to that. It's easy to miss, and it's not lit prominently, not held up to the camera, not called out by any other character. It's just there the way it's been there across seasons, a detail so habitual it has become part of the silhouette. A man who still measures time, who still wears a marker on the before world on his body, against the skin of his wrist where a pulse beats, who is, in this moment of declarative triumph, still tethered to something he came from. Here's what I couldn't stop turning over once I really sat with it. The speech uses the word live, not survive, not endure or persist, or any of the harder, more functional words the Apocalypse vocabulary has accumulated across the preceding seasons. Live. As if Rick still believes, or still needs to believe, that what they're doing has a quality to it beyond pure biological continuation. That there's something waiting on the other side of the survival that justifies the cost of reaching it. That the word means something different from the word survive, and the difference matters. Was that true by season 5? After Shane, after the prison, after the governor, after the road between the prison and terminus, after the things done in the dark and in churches and on highways, in the name of the people walking behind him. Was living still the right word for what Rick Grimes was doing? Or had living quietly become surviving somewhere in the middle seasons? And the speech was Rick choosing not to acknowledge the distance between those two words because acknowledging it would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. I didn't want to follow that question to its end. The more I looked, the harder it was to ignore where it was leading. The show frames Rick's changes as heroic in the moment and troubling in the rear view. That pattern repeats so consistently across seasons that it stops feeling like narrative texture and starts feeling like design. Every time Rick crosses a line, every time the audience is invited to understand and even endorse the crossing, the show places a small marker somewhere in the frame, a quieter moment just before or just after, an expression on another character's face that holds a second too long, a detail that, in the next season, you look back at and think, that was when. That was the moment I was watching a threshold cross, and I was reading it as something else, because the show needed me to. The watch, worn throughout. Time from before still marking itself on the body of a man who is becoming something the before world never produced a category for. Was Rick's transformation a character arc? Or the show's thesis wearing a character's face? I'm not sure those two things are entirely different. And I think that ambiguity might be the most honest possible answer the show was capable of giving. The blueprint was Rick. The thesis could only have been expressed through this specific man, with this specific history, with this specific capacity for both extraordinary tenderness and terrible clarity. It couldn't have been anyone else. The show needed someone we loved before it started changing him. File away the distinction between live and survive. It becomes important later, more important than it looks right now. There's a moment in the very first episode of Season 1 that I keep returning to, now that I've spent so long inside the later seasons of this arc. It's not dramatic. Nobody dies in it. Nothing is established about the apocalypse or what's coming. It's just Rick Grimes in his police cruiser, on a quiet Georgia road calling Laurie on his radio because he's been working a night shift and he wants to hear her voice. They talk about ordinary things. He has a concern about Carl, something small, a parenting disagreement, the kind of low-stakes friction that fills a marriage when the rest of life is basically functioning. Laurie pushes back gently. They're in a conversation that's been running for a while without resolution, the kind that married people have not because they can't agree, but because they're still in the process of figuring out what agreeing looks like for them specifically. They're a family, mid-argument, in the soft, ordinary way families argue when nobody is in danger. He's wearing the watch. Of course he is. He's a working man in the old world, and the watch means shift times and handovers, and the hour Carl's school ends, and the time Laurie expects him home for dinner. It measures a life organised around other people's rhythms, a life that has the texture of a specific community, a specific profession, a specific web of responsibilities. Time that belongs, in the broad sense, to the people around him. The watch is not personal in this scene. It's communal. It marks the shared schedule of a man who has given his time over to others and considers that the right way to live. The radio call ends. The world ends or begins ending in the specific quiet way it ends in this show. Not with an announced catastrophe, but with everything that was organising reality simply stopping being reliable, stopping being true. One system at a time until the whole grammar of the before world becomes a language. Nobody around you speaks anymore. I want to name Rick's values precisely as the show establishes them in those early episodes, because the arc that follows is only legible if we understand exactly what's being eroded. Law first. Not as an abstract principle, but as a daily practice. The specific discipline of a man who had chosen law enforcement as a vocation and had absorbed its framework as character. Due process. The belief that procedure matters even when the outcome seems obvious, that the mechanism of justice has value independent of any particular verdict it produces. And the one I find most revealing, protecting even the guilty from mob justice. That position, the willingness to defend someone you believe is wrong because the alternative is a system you believe is worse, is a harder, costlier, more philosophically serious position than simply protecting the innocent. It means Rick had thought carefully about what justice requires and concluded it requires restraint. Procedure. The deliberate creation of space between accusation and consequence. He argues for this in Season 1 when the group debates Randall's fate. He advocates for the process when the process is genuinely costly. He is, in those episodes, a man who believes in the framework more than any particular application of it. Now, here's the question I want you to hold gently as we go forward, because I think it's more interesting than it first appears. If the pre-apocalypse Rick, the man on the radio, negotiating parenting with Laurie, wearing the watch in a world that knows what to do with it, had somehow encountered the Season 5 Rick standing in Alexandria, declaring that his people live, what would he have thought? Not felt. Thought. Evaluated against the moral framework he'd spent a career building and inhabiting. I think there would have been recognition underneath whatever else that meeting produced. Not approval, maybe, but recognition. A sense of, I can follow the logic of how you got here. I can see every step of the path. And I'm not sure, standing here on this quiet road with the old world still running, that I could make a clean argument you were wrong, given what I can see you've been through. That moral vertigo. The inability to draw a hard line between the man who believed in due process and the man who executed people in a church without hesitation is what the show was constructing across all those seasons. Not an accident. Not a failure of moral clarity. The point. The destination the watch was always marking time toward. The radio crackles. Nobody answers. The last moment the old rules applied, preserved in amber, in 6 episodes of Season 1 before the show, begins its long, methodical work of taking them apart. I resisted the blueprint reading for a long time. The idea that the show had designed a specific destination for Rick Grimes before the audience understood what they were watching felt, depending on how you held it, either like too much credit or too little. Too much because it implies a coherence across a 13-season franchise that television almost never maintains. Too little because if the change was always predetermined, if the arc had a fixed endpoint Rick was always moving toward, then his choices along the way carry less moral weight than they seem to. They're not choices, they're marks on a path. And then I kept looking at Season 2, Episode 12, and I couldn't find a reading that didn't feel like the blueprint activating. Rick kills Shane in a field at night, in a confrontation that Shane appears to have deliberately engineered. Whether Shane wanted to die or wanted to force Rick into finally becoming the thing Shane had been arguing he needed to become, or simply reached the end of what was available to him and found only this exit. Those interpretations live in the scene simultaneously without resolving, and the show earns that ambiguity fully. What's unambiguous is the act. Rick drives a knife into his best friend's chest, the man he'd known before the world ended, the man who kept his family alive through the weeks Rick was in a coma, who made decisions in Rick's name without being asked to, who carried the weight of an impossible situation, and did it, primarily and genuinely, out of love. Shane Walsh, dead in the field at night by Rick's hand. The watch is on his wrist in this scene, and this is the moment I started to think about the motif differently. Not as a tether to the before world exactly, not simply as a symbol of continuity with what Rick used to be, more as a dividing line the watch itself can't acknowledge, but we can see from outside. Time before Shane's death, time after it. The show splits Rick's arc here as definitively as it splits anything, and everything that comes in the subsequent seasons is, in some real sense, post-Shane Rick. A man who is established for himself and for the watching audience that there is no line he will not cross when he calculates that the people behind him require it. Here's what I keep returning to about how the scene is constructed. Rick doesn't do this impulsively. He'd been resisting the logic for 2 seasons. The logic Shane kept putting in front of him. Calmly, insistently, sometimes angrily, about what the world had become and what it required from people who intended to survive it. Shane was right about a great deal, and Rick knew it. And the killing's not the act of a man who has lost control or been pushed beyond his capacity for rational decision-making. It's the act of a man who has finally, completely, accepted the argument his best friend was making, and in the moment of acceptance, committed the act that makes the acceptance irreversible. He could not accept that the world required a different kind of person than the one he'd been trained to be, and then remain the person he'd been trained to be. The acceptance and the act are the same movement. He chose. That's the thing the blueprint reading forces you to sit with. And I think it's the most important thing about this moment. Not what the world did to Rick, what Rick did. Was the change the world forced on him, grinding down a good man through impossible circumstances until something necessary broke? Or was the change Rick chose, with the world providing the justification and the permission and the witness, but the choice itself originating somewhere inside him that had always been capable of it? I genuinely don't know. I've been sitting with this for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. And I think the show doesn't know either, or decided, wisely I think, not to resolve it, because the unresolved version is the true version. Both things are happening. The world shaped him, and he chose. The line was crossed under duress, and it was crossed willingly. The blueprint was the show's, and it was Rick's character realising itself. Carl is nearby, not in the exact field but close enough. He stops Shane from turning. He fires the shot that ends the scene. The boy who had been watching his father and his father's best friend circle each other for 2 seasons, absorbing something he doesn't have language for yet, does the final thing the scene requires. He looks at his father afterward. From Carl's perspective, from the perspective of a boy watching what just happened to the 2 men he loved most in the world. This isn't a murder. It's a lesson. Delivered in a field at night, with a watch on his father's wrist marking the exact moment everything split into before and after. Before we follow the evidence any further, I want to stop and sit with something that the arc keeps moving past too quickly. The question that I think is most important and most costly. What was Rick protecting? And what did protecting it cost him? The answer the show gives consistently and across many seasons is Carl. Every hard choice Rick makes from the Shane decision forward is framed by Rick himself, in his own expressed logic, in the arguments he makes to the group and to himself, as being for Carl, for the world Carl will inherit, for the future of the child he loves more than he has ever fully been able to say out loud. Carl is the justification, the reason the crossing is acceptable, the thing on the other side of every threshold that makes the crossing worth the price. The watch in this chapter's framing is time marked toward Carl. Every hour survived, every threat neutralised, every line crossed in the name of protection, all of it measurable against the destination of a world where Carl lives, where Carl grows up, where the sacrifice accumulated across seasons bought something real and lasting. The watch doesn't just track the past, it tracks what the past was supposed to be building toward. Rick's relationship with Carl, across seasons 1 through 4, is one of the most genuinely affecting things the franchise produced. It's specific in the way that only real emotional investment produces. The particular texture of a man trying to be a particular kind of father in circumstances that keep removing the conditions that make that kind of fathering possible. He reads to Carl. He talks to Carl about difficult things with the careful, searching honesty of a man who's trying not to lie and also trying not to terrify. He makes decisions repeatedly, explicitly. With Carl named as the reason, protecting Carl, preparing Carl, building toward a version of the world that Carl can inhabit with something like dignity. The loneliness underneath that, the specific quiet loneliness of a man whose moral life is organised entirely around justifications that are always external, runs through the arc like a current below the surface. It doesn't announce itself. You feel it in the spaces between scenes, in the pauses the camera holds on Rick's face after a decision has been completed and the immediate emergency has passed, and there's a fraction of a second before the next thing begins. He looks at the distance in those moments with an expression that isn't quite grief and isn't quite relief. Something more like the face of a man trying to remember what it was he was protecting, and whether the version of it that survives each crossing still resembles the version he started with. Here's the question I want to be honest about. Did the show allow Rick to want things for himself? Not for the group, not for Carl, not for the abstract future of human civilization that Carl's survival is supposed to represent. For Rick Grimes specifically, for the man inside the leadership function, the man underneath the justifications, the person who presumably had desires and preferences and fears that were his own rather than the aggregate of everyone else's survival needs. Did that person get to want anything? I'm not sure the show fully allowed it. Rick's arc is so thoroughly organised around his relationships and responsibilities that the question of what he wants, separate from those relationships, rarely gets direct attention. He is, across most of his arc, a vehicle for other people's futures. The watch marks time for purposes that are always externally defined, and the arc keeps removing the people for whom the choices are made. Laurie, Herschel, Glenn eventually, and then Carl himself, which is the loss the arc seems both to require and to recoil from. The destination disappearing while the man is still moving toward it. The justification keeps dissolving, and Rick keeps going anyway, which is either the show saying the change has become self-sustaining, that survival no longer needs a reason beyond itself, or the show saying that love, once it's been the reason long enough, becomes load-bearing in your identity, even after the person has gone. That you carry forward what you built in their name not because they're there to receive it, but because stopping would mean admitting the cost was for nothing. Carl, as moral anchor, and Carl as moral permission are not entirely different things. The child who justifies the hard choice also authorises it, and the man wearing the watch, marking time toward a destination he defines as his son's future, is also marking time toward a version of himself he will eventually have to acknowledge is the version the arc was always building, which is where we need to go next. To the thing the show took away to make everything, after it possible. Laurie dies in the 4th episode of Season 3. She dies in childbirth in the prison, while Rick is doing something necessary somewhere else in the building. Maggie delivers Judith by emergency cesarean. Carl shoots Laurie to prevent her turning. The sequence is brutal in its economy. The show doesn't linger beyond what the emotional honesty requires, and the efficiency somehow makes it worse, makes it feel more like something that happened to a real person, and less like a narrative event handled at a managed distance. Rick's response is what I want to spend time with, because it's not the response of a man who has already become the finished version of the thing the arc is building toward. It's not cold, it's not strategic, it's not processed through the filter of leadership and the need to remain functional for the group. It's the response of a man who is completely, entirely, structurally, undone. Daryl brings him the news. Daryl, who is carrying Judith, who is holding the living evidence of both the loss and what survived it, tells Rick what happened, and Rick receives the information in the way that information of this scale gets received. All at once, from the inside, with no adequate external response available. He drops to his knees. He begins to laugh, which is what some specific kinds of grief do when they exceed the available emotional vocabulary. They reach for the nearest inappropriate register, and the laugh that comes out sounds nothing like laughter, sounds like the body making any sound it can to avoid the silence. Then he goes into the prison corridors, and he kills walkers until there are none left to kill, and then he sits down on the floor of a room that used to be something, and is now just a space inside the disaster he's living in. The watch is still on his wrist, still running, in the before world's units, while inside Rick something is running at a completely different speed and in a completely different direction. The timekeeper from the before world and the grief of the afterworld operating simultaneously, out of register, creating a dissonance the watch has no mechanism for marking. He calls the dead on a telephone. He finds a working handset somewhere in the depths of the prison, and he dials and it rings and a voice answers. Or he hears a voice, or the specific texture of grief at this magnitude creates presence where there is none, or the boundary between those possibilities has become less clear in this world than it was in the one the watch was made for. He talks to Laurie, he talks to Amy, he talks to people the show has already taken. The phone is a gesture, the gesture of a man trying to reach across a line that has never worked in both directions, in any world, and doing it anyway because the alternative is accepting the direction of travel. The silence inside the receiver, after the voice fades, is the image the scene leaves you with. I want to name the pattern here, because I think it's the most structurally significant thing the show does across the middle seasons, and it's the thing I most resisted acknowledging when I was first working through the arc. The show removes Rick's stabilising relationship systematically, in sequence, before each escalation of the arc's demands. Laurie's death is the first major removal. She was the person most tethered to the before-world Rick, the one who had known him longest, who had a relationship with the man he was before the apocalypse that nobody else in the group could replicate, who could, in principle, have pulled him back simply by being present and remembering. Her absence removes that anchor at precisely the moment the arc begins requiring Rick to operate without one. Is Rick's change a response to this grief? Absolutely, in part. Grief at this scale reshapes a person in ways that can't be reversed, and the show is honest about the mechanism. But I want to hold the second question too, the one that's less comfortable. Did the show engineer the grief to enable the change it had always planned? Did the arc need Laurie to die here, at this specific point, at the beginning of season 3, just as the governor was establishing himself as the external pressure that would require a particular kind of Rick to resist? Because the story couldn't get where it needed to go while she was still present. I don't think the grief is diminished by the question. The grief is fully real within the show's reality, earned and honest and devastating. But the question and the grief can coexist. The phone goes quiet. Rick holds it to his chest with both hands. Nobody answers anymore. Carl Grimes shoots his mother to stop her turning. He's around 12 years old. He does it without being asked, without waiting for an adult to make the call, having understood what was required, and having decided, alone in the moment, with a specific clarity of someone who has already been living in this world long enough to understand its grammar, that he was the one who needed to do it. Not because he was capable, because he was there and it needed doing. and waiting would cost something he wasn't willing to cost. Rick understands what Carl did when he sees Carl's face. He doesn't need it explained. The understanding arrives whole in one image. And what it does to Rick, the expression that moves across his face, is one of the show's most precisely observed moments. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, something more complex. The recognition of what his child has had to absorb and do and carry forward, combined with the recognition of how thoroughly the world has moved on from any version of childhood Rick had been trying to preserve for Carl, combined with something that might be, underneath everything else, a terrible kind of understanding. A father looking at his son and seeing the reflection of decisions he's been making since season 2. Seeing that Carl has arrived by a different and faster and more devastating route at the same place. The watch. Carl is now marking time the way his father does. Not by hours or appointments or the ordinary navigational markers of the before world. By what it costs to reach any given moment. By the specific, irreversible weight of decisions made in the dark that you carry forward, because forward is the only direction available. What I find most significant about Carl's arc across the middle seasons is how deliberately the show positions him as Rick's mirror rather than his echo. Not a younger version of the same transformation, moving along a parallel track. A mirror. Something that shows Rick what the changes look like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who loves him completely and is watching the transformation and cannot stop it and is developing season by season a clearer and more heartbreaking understanding of what it means. Every major line Rick crosses, Carl is nearby, sometimes present, sometimes close enough to receive the atmospheric evidence of it, the particular quality of his father's silences, the way the adults around him adjust their behaviour in the aftermath of whatever Rick has decided. Carl learns to read Rick the way a person learns to read weather. Through pressure and small changes in the light and the specific stillness that precedes a shift in conditions. He becomes expert at it. He has to be. The expertise is a form of love. And he keeps choosing to believe. That is the detail I find most affecting, and the one most consistently under-acknowledged in discussions of this arc. Carl, who has seen more than anyone his age should see, who has done things that were never going to be on any list of things a child should have to do, who has absorbed the full unfiltered reality of the world they're living in without the buffer that adults attempt to maintain around their own understanding of it. Carl still writes the letter. At the end, in season 8, dying from a walker bite, he writes to the people he loves. He writes to Rick. And what he writes includes, among its most essential requests, be better than this. Build the world that's worth building. Let Negan live and make the mercy mean something. Don't let what the world cost you become the only thing you are. What does it mean that Carl's dying wish was for Rick to be better, and that he trusted Rick enough to ask? It means he never stopped believing that the arc had another stage available, that underneath the transformation was something still reachable, still capable of hearing the letter and doing something with it. He believed to the end that the man his father was becoming wasn't the final version of his father. The letter reaches Rick in season 9. By then, Carl is gone, and what Rick does with the request, the cost of trying to honour it, the specific form the honouring takes, is part of what makes the bridge possible, part of what makes the bridge necessary. The boy who still believed, the watch on the wrist of the man the boy believed in, the time between them, marked and unmarked, running forward. The governor is the character the show uses to deliver a specific lesson, and I want to be careful about how I frame this because the framing matters for what comes next. I'm not arguing the governor is a device. He's a fully realised character, Philip Blake with his own history and his own grief and his own specific kind of damage. And the show treats him with the complexity he deserves. But within the architecture of Rick's arc, the governor functions as teacher, and the lesson he delivers is one the arc required before it could move to its next stage. The prison versus governor conflict unfolds across seasons 3 and 4, with the particular rhythm of a show that wants you to believe reconciliation is possible for slightly longer than it is. In season 4, Rick and the governor meet alone in an abandoned feed store and talk. They sit across a table from each other in a ruined building, and Rick makes an offer that is genuinely extraordinary, given the history between them and everything the governor has done. "Come live with us," Rick says. An invitation to coexistence, to the possibility that two groups who have been in violent opposition can share territory and build something that doesn't end in one of them being destroyed. The governor rejects it and then attacks the prison. And the cost is Herschel's death, the destruction of the home Rick had been building, the scatter of the group across the Georgia countryside in midwinter with nothing. The mercy offer, extended at real personal and political cost, is punished at the highest available price. The watch in this chapter is running differently, not toward a destination anymore, toward an edge, running out of the kind of time that allows for the negotiating position, running out of the particular resource that making peace requires, the belief that the other person is capable of receiving it. Here's what the governor's arc does to Rick's arc, structurally. It provides empirical evidence. Rick had beliefs about what mercy could accomplish, about what extending trust might create, about whether the harder work of coexistence was worth its cost. The governor arc runs the experiment. The results come back, and the show is scrupulous about what the results say. Not that mercy is wrong as an abstract moral position, but that mercy extended to this specific person, in this specific configuration, produced this specific outcome. Evidence. Rick is a man trained in evidence. He notes it. Was the governor the lesson, or was Rick the lesson and the governor only the teacher? I keep turning that question over because it changes what the arc means depending on which answer you hold. If the governor was the lesson, the world instructing Rick through suffering, then Rick's subsequent hardening is a reasonable person responding to evidence. If Rick was the lesson, the show using Rick's experience to demonstrate something to the audience about what mercy costs, then Rick isn't learning so much as exemplifying, and the governor was simply the most vivid available instrument of demonstration. Both readings feel true. The show allows both. The most uncomfortable thing about the governor arc is that it's impossible to know, from inside the story, whether the evidence it provides represents the world or represents one particularly expensive data point that Rick may be over-indexing on, whether the lesson is mercy is costly or mercy extended to this specific kind of person without adequate protective preparation is costly. The difference between those two lessons is enormous, and the show doesn't resolve which one Rick absorbs, but Terminus is coming. The show will run the same test again. Mercy considered, mercy costly, with greater efficiency, a tighter timeline, and a cleaner result. As if the governor's lesson needed reinforcing before the arc could move to the next stage. As if one piece of evidence wasn't enough to complete the argument the blueprint was building. File Terminus away. It's the proof of concept. We'll need it. Terminus is efficient in a way the governor arc deliberately wasn't. Where the governor took 2 seasons to teach his lesson, Terminus needs approximately 1 episode to deliver the same instruction at higher concentration. The show is moving faster by season 5. The audience has been trained. Rick has been trained. The lesson can be compressed. Season 5, Episode 3. The church in the woods outside of Atlanta. Rick has a red-handled machete and a promise he made to Gareth when the immediate situation was different. Not a vague threat, a specific one. He told Gareth, clearly and without theatrical decoration, exactly what instrument he would use, and exactly what he would do. He made the promise in the kind of voice that doesn't leave room for the listener to decide he doesn't mean it. And then, in the church, he keeps the promise. What the scene records, what I couldn't stop returning to once I'd noticed it clearly, is not the act itself. It's the texture of the act. Rick is not conflicted in this scene. Not in the way he was when he killed Shane. That scene full of the specific anguish of a man who knows with complete precision what he is crossing and what it costs him personally to cross it. Not in the way the Governor arc registered, where you could see Rick trying every available alternative, before arriving at the conclusion that no alternative was going to hold. In the church, the hesitation that used to exist between Rick's recognition of what needed to happen and his doing of it is simply absent. Not suppressed, not controlled through force of will. Gone. Replaced by something quieter and more complete. A man who made a commitment and is honouring it with the settled matter-of-factness of someone doing a job that needs doing. The watch. He's no longer checking it. That's the image the motif is doing in this part of the arc. The before world used the watch to mark the space between decision and action. The time it took to think the decision through, to run the alternatives, to convince yourself that the thing you were about to do was necessary and proportionate and justified. Rick doesn't use the watch that way anymore. It's still on his wrist. It's still running. But the relationship between the time it marks and the decisions he makes has changed. The measurement and the action are no longer coordinated. He acts and the watch continues separately, marking time for a framework that the actions have outpaced. When did Rick stop having to convince himself? That's the question this scene raises, and it doesn't have a clean answer, because it wasn't a single moment. It was accumulation. Shane, Laurie's death and the phone calls to the dead, the Governor and the price of the mercy offer, the road between the prison and terminus, during which the group survived things that required Rick to be something specific, and he became that thing, and discovered that becoming doesn't come with an undue function. By the time they reach that church, the internal debate has reached a verdict, and the jury has returned, and the question of whether to is no longer the question. The question is only when and how. Is that bad? I kept asking myself this, sitting with the church scene. The honest answer I kept arriving at was, it depends entirely on what the quality is in service of. A man without internal conflict around necessary and proportionate decisions might be someone who has found genuine moral clarity, who has thought long enough and hard enough that the uncertainty has resolved into understanding, the way uncertainty sometimes does. Or he might be someone who has stopped engaging in the process that generates the uncertainty, which is a different and more troubling thing. The show holds both possibilities open and doesn't tell you which this is. It shows you the outcome and lets you determine the diagnosis. Alexandria will be the next test, the most interesting one, because it doesn't test Rick with a threat that matches the capability he's developed. It tests him with ordinary safety, with people who haven't been ground down the way he's been ground down, living inside walls that have held, in a world that still looks, from the inside, something like the before world. The test is, what does this version of Rick do with comfort, with routine, with a community that hasn't yet learned what he knows? Which brings us somewhere I didn't fully expect when I started pulling at this thread. Alexandria is the most revealing test in Rick's arc, precisely because it doesn't test him with danger. Every previous test, Shane the Governor Terminus, placed Rick inside a situation where the threat was external and identifiable, and his capabilities were directly applicable to the problem in front of him. Alexandria removes the external threat and replaces it with something the Ark has not prepared him for: the experience of being the threat, or at least of being perceived as one. Rick arrives at Alexandria in the second half of Season 5, and what the show stages in his first weeks there is not relief. Not the unwinding of a man who's been under extraordinary pressure for years and has finally found a place to put the pressure down. What it stages is assessment. Rick walks through Alexandria the way a person walks through a space they are evaluating, reading the walls, the people, the layout, the specific vulnerabilities, the gap between the community's self-understanding, and what Rick's experienced eyes can see about how sustainable its self-understanding actually is. The watch. Everyone else in Alexandria still uses it the way it was designed to be used. They have appointments, schedules, the ordinary social architecture of a community that has maintained enough continuity with the before world to still organise itself around shared time. Rick's watch and their watches are telling different times, in a sense that has nothing to do with the numbers on the face. His watch marks time from a different kind of world. It runs on a different fuel, the same instrument, worn differently, for entirely different purposes. The community's discomfort with Rick registers almost immediately. The competence reads as menace to people who haven't developed it the same way. He moves differently. His silences have a different quality. He does efficiently and without visible distress things that the Alexandrians approach with caution and cost. And the efficiency, to people who haven't lived through what produced it, looks like something is missing, where something should be, like the absence of normal human hesitation. Like the thing that's supposed to make difficult things feel difficult has been removed. This is where I really didn't want to look clearly. Because what Alexandria shows us is that by this point in the arc, the change has become self-sustaining. The world outside the walls doesn't have to keep pushing. Rick is already past the threshold in a permanent and structural way. He exists in Alexandria with the full alertness of someone in ongoing danger, even when the managed danger is behind the walls. The adaptation that was developed under continuous pressure doesn't switch off when the pressure is temporarily relieved. It has become the baseline. It is simply who he is. The show surfaces something in this section of the arc that is usually discussed in fandom terms. Rick considering whether to take Alexandria by force if the Alexandrians prove unable to adapt to what the world requires of their leadership. This isn't a stray thought or a passing desperation. It's expressed explicitly in conversations with the group as a tactical contingency, a protection of the community logic extended to its endpoint. If the people currently in charge of this community cannot be made to understand what protection actually requires, then the people who do understand may need to assume control. The logic is internally consistent with everything Rick has built across the preceding seasons. From outside that logic, it is the exact moment the adaptation stops being a response to external threat and starts being a disposition that would generate threat where none existed. At what point does the adaptation stop being a response to the world and start being just who you are? I don't think there's a clean line. I think it's a gradual, almost imperceptible process where the mode of being that was developed for a specific kind of pressure becomes the default mode for all situations, and the person inside it gradually loses access to the before version as a felt possibility rather than just a memory. Rick can remember the before Rick. He doesn't have easy access to him anymore. He walks Alexandria's walls at night, alone. the detail the show uses to close this section of the arc. Not performing guard duty. There are guards, doing what guards do. Rick walking the perimeter for reasons that have less to do with threat assessment than with the fact that standing inside the walls, doing nothing, isn't something he knows how to do anymore. Moving along the border of a thing, in the dark, trying to understand his relationship to what's inside it. Not guarding, assessing. The Negan lineup in Season 7's first episode's the most expensive single scene in Rick's arc. And I want to approach it slowly because it's doing several things at once, and I don't want to collapse them. Rick is on his knees in the dark. Negan has them surrounded with a thoroughness that forecloses every tactical angle Rick has developed over 9 seasons of being the person who finds angles. There are no angles here. The calculation that Rick has been running, the one that converts every threat into solvable problem, that finds the exit in every room, hits a wall. He is, for the first time since the tank in Season 1, completely without the tools his arc has given him. The watch on his wrist, the authority it once represented, the capability that has become identity, none of it is relevant to this room. This night, this man standing above him with a barbed wire bat and the specific ease of someone who has done this many times and expects it to go the same way this time. Glenn dies. Abraham dies. And then Negan takes Rick through the RV in a sequence designed to find the bottom of him. He wants to locate and expose and demonstrate to both Rick and the audience the point at which all the arc's construction collapses into pure submission. He creates a situation in which Rick must consider bringing an axe down on Carl's arm. And Rick, who has crossed every threshold the arc placed in front of him without this specific kind of breaking, cannot do it. He falls apart. The shell opens in a way it hasn't since the prison floor after Laurie died. The tears come. The begging comes. The thing that the arc has been building for seasons, the controlled, certain, increasingly unhesitating Rick, cracks entirely under the specific and irreducible pressure of his child's life. Negan watches this with something that looks like satisfaction and calls it good enough. Here's where the two readings live, and I want to give them both the space they deserve. Reading 1. Negan breaks Rick into something smaller than what he was. The submission that follows. The season of Rick operating under Negan's authority, delivering tribute, enforcing saviour rules, doing the theatre of compliance while presumably building towards something, represents a genuine diminishment. The arc that had been building toward a harder and more certain, Rick gets interrupted at its highest point and reset to something that superficially resembles the Season 1 Rick who hadn't yet understood what the world required. Except it's worse than Season 1 Rick in a specific way. It's a man who knows exactly what the world requires and is choosing for now not to exercise that knowledge, which is its own kind of crossing. A crossing of pride, of self-image, of the version of himself the arc had constructed. Reading 2. Negan completes the final stage of the change. What Negan breaks in the RV isn't Rick's capability. That comes back, clearly and quickly, as the Season 7 and 8 arcs progress. What Negan breaks is the last layer of performance. The presentation of a man who has never fully accepted that there are situations beyond his ability to work and exit from. The facade of certainty. Negan strips that away, and what's underneath is not nothing. It's a Rick who has to rebuild from something more exposed and more honest, who has to choose the fight not from the high ground of the previous season's accumulated confidence, but from something quieter. Something more like the basic, undramatic refusal to stop. The thematic echo the scene builds is one of the show's best. Rick on his knees in Season 7 mirrors. Rick in the tank in Season 1. Surrounded, outgunned, with no visible exit. The differences between those two moments are the entire arc. In the tank, Rick called for help and Glenn answered, and the answer came, and the situation resolved, and Rick walked out with more information and the beginning of the family he'd spend the series building. In the lineup, there's no call to make. There's no Glenn answering on the other end. The situation doesn't resolve. It concludes on Negan's terms. Carl is there. He watches his father. He understands something in this moment that he will write about later, in the letter, in the most expensive request he ever makes of Rick. Did Negan break Rick, or reveal what was underneath the leadership all along? Both. Always both. The bridge is the image I return to again and again when I try to understand what the arc was building toward, and whether the destination justifies the journey. Season 9, Episode 5. Rick has spent the preceding weeks trying to hold together an alliance that wants to fracture. The communities that fought the Saviors together, now trying to negotiate the peace that Carl's letter described, and that Rick is trying to build in Carl's name, at the specific cost of maintaining relationships with people who have reason to want the peace to fail. He's mediating, compromising, making the case for a future that his own arc, honestly described, seems to have been moving away from, rather than toward. He's wearing the watch, still wearing it, marked against everything that's accumulated in the time since it last belonged to a world that knew what to do with it. A herd comes toward the bridge. Rick draws it away, gets thrown from his horse, lands badly on rebar. He's injured in a way that makes the immediate future clear. The herd is coming. The people who love him are coming too, from the other direction. He looks at the dynamite. He looks at the distance. He runs the calculation one more time, in the mode the arc has built him for, and the calculation produces a clear result. He blows up the bridge. From the ground from where Michonne and Daryl and the others are watching, it looks like Rick Grimes just died. The explosion that stops the herd is also, as far as the people who love him can see, the explosion that ends him. The CRM helicopter is there, it takes him. He survives, invisible to his family, and is gone from the show and from his family's lives for years, until the ones who live accounts for some of the time inside the CRM's custody, and the eventual choice that brings him back to Michonne. 2 readings held open and given equal weight. Reading 1. The sacrifice is the change completing itself, arriving at the highest possible cost at the moment the blueprint was always building toward. The man who had to become hard in order to protect the people he loved finally chooses softness at the exact moment softness is most expensive. Not a tactical decision dressed as a moral one, a moral decision without tactical cover. He draws the herd, he holds on, he calculates that the people behind him live if the bridge goes, and he makes the choice that looks for the first time in a long time like the pre-apocalypse Rick would have recognized. The man who believed in protecting people even at cost to himself. Acting out of that belief, one final time, in the only form the new world makes available. Reading 2. The sacrifice is Rick's escape. Not from the herd. From the version of himself the ark built and couldn't sustain indefinitely inside a world that was beginning to reach for something more peaceful. The man who walked Alexandria's walls, assessing rather than guarding, who moved past the internal conflict that used to slow his decisions, who had become self-sustaining in his adaptation. That man was not someone who could live inside the future Carl described. The bridge is the exit from an arc that had exhausted its own logic, and the CRM, in a dark irony, gives Rick another version of the same function. A world that needs exactly what he became, in a different uniform, for different masters. The Ones Who Live adds a Rick I'm still processing. Someone who survived years of CRM captivity, who tried to escape and couldn't, who chose Michonne and their children over the CRM's definition of his purpose. Whether that Rick is a continuation of the arc or a different story wearing the same name is a question the franchise is still, in some sense, answering. Both feel possible. Both feel honest to something. The watch on the bridge. On his wrist, in the last shot the show gives us of Rick as Rick before the helicopter, and the years and the rest of whatever comes next. Still running, still marking time in the before world's units, on the body of a man who has been, for a long time, operating in a different time zone entirely. Where is it now? Who has it? What does it mark wherever it is, in whatever light is left? We're back where we started. Everyone's been asking whether Rick Grimes went too far. The fandom debate has been running since the middle seasons. The throat in the dark, the church, the consideration of taking Alexandria, the compliance under Negan that felt like surrender and might have been strategy. The years of hard decisions stacked in sequence until the stack became the man. At what point did the protagonist stop being someone we were supposed to follow and become something we were supposed to examine? Where is the line? I didn't want to believe there was a blueprint. I wanted the arc to be messier, more contingent, more genuinely responsive to circumstance and less structurally predetermined. Mess is more comforting in a way. It means the choices were real choices, not marks on a path, and the person who emerged from them is a particular person, rather than an argument assembled in human form. The more I looked at the evidence, the more I traced the arc from the radio call in the car to the bridge, from the watch worn casually, in a world that knew how to use it, to the watch worn as the last relic of a framework the arc has spent 9 seasons dismantling. The harder it was to ignore what the blueprint was doing, the show was always building toward this. The arc had a shape before Rick completed it. But the shape and the man were never separate. The blueprint was expressed through Rick's character, not imposed on it. And that's the distinction I keep landing on at the end of all of this, because I think it matters. Reading 1. Rick's change was the show's honest thesis. Survival costs the self, not as bumper sticker philosophy, but as clinical observation. The watch keeps ticking, but what it marks changes. Accumulation isn't neutral. The person who comes out the other side of 9 seasons of what this show put Rick through is not the person who went in, and the show is saying, of course not. Look at the receipts. Look at what each crossing cost and what it bought, and add it up. The arithmetic is honest. The answer is the person who blew up the bridge. Reading 2. Rick's change was the show's ongoing question. Is the person who survives the apocalypse still the person who entered it? Not a thesis. A question held open across the whole run, never resolved, still running. Because identity isn't a container that either holds or doesn't. It's a river that remains recognisably itself, while every molecule of its water is eventually replaced. The Rick who stands on the bridge is not the Rick in the car with the radio. But he wore the watch all the way through. He heard Carl's letter. He chose at the end the people he loved over the version of himself the arc had built. The continuity is thread-thin and unbroken, running through everything the change removed, and everything it built in the space where what was removed used to be. The watch at the end. Somewhere in the franchise that's still unfolding. In Judith's keeping maybe, or in a drawer somewhere, or on a wrist the show hasn't shown us yet. Still ticking, or stopped. Still marking time or marking something else now. The question of whether it's still Rick's time or someone else's, hanging in the air like the smoke from the bridge, like the smoke from Atlanta in season 1, like the smoke from every building, this story is burned on its way to wherever it's going. Maybe Rick didn't go too far. Maybe the show was always asking us whether there was a too far left to go. And what we feel about the answer says as much about us as anything it says about him. I keep coming back to the watch. The before world's instrument. Still somewhere in the story, running or not running, marking time in whatever system is still available. The live versus survive distinction I asked you to file away in the first chapter. I think the watch is where it lives. The choice to keep wearing it, to keep marking time in the before world's units, even when the before world is gone, is the choice to keep believing live and survive are different words pointing at different things, that the difference matters, that there's something on the other side of the survival that the surviving's supposed to be building toward. Rick kept the watch on, all the way to the bridge, all the way through. Whatever that means, whatever it says about him and about the show and about the question we've been turning over together tonight, I think it means something.